Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Fox Focus. I'm Susan Buehler. The tax deadline is rapidly approaching. In fact, it's less than 2 weeks away. One of our guests today admits he has several complaints about the U.S. tax policy. He's Sheldon Pollack, author of The Failure of U.S. Tax Policy, and he'll share with us why he believes that the U.S. tax policy is, quote, dysfunctional. Later, we'll be joined by a tax attorney who'll give some last-minute filing tips, along with an accountant from the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. Thank you for joining us. Dysfunctional is probably, to put it mildly, in your book, The Failure of U.S. Tax Policy. You make a lot of serious complaints and charges. Tell me a little bit about what they are.
Well, Susan, the tax code is becoming more and more complicated, especially started in 1970s and 80s to become incredibly political. We've seen a high degree of partisan use of the tax code in the last several decades, and that started to result in a higher degree of complexity. I have to say one thing, though, the tax code is not a failure in one very important respect. It raises an awful lot of revenue. It raises about 60% of the revenue of the federal government, and in 1998 it raised over $1 trillion, which is not a small amount of money. So in respect of raising revenue and providing funds for the operation of the federal government, the income tax is quite successful. The problem, I think, is that we're trying to do really much too much with the income tax. We're trying to enact economic policy through the tax code and lots of social policies that perhaps should be policies but not in tax code. Might be better off as general appropriations bills. You're saying that the taxes raised shouldn't be funding these social programs? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, well, people would argue that the primary function of the tax code is to raise revenue, and yet it's so very convenient for politicians to use the tax code as a subtle way to benefit constituents is one major area that adds to the incredible complexity of the tax code. It would be very unusual for a congressman who sits on an important committee, the Ways and Means Committee or the Senate Finance Committee, not to provide benefits for key economic interests in his home district. If you happen to be from the Midwest, of course you try to help farmers through the tax code. If you're from Texas, you help oil and gas. If you're from Delaware, you like to help banking industries. All that adds special provisions to the tax code that ultimately erodes the revenue that the tax code can raise and introduces more complexity, more provisions to the tax code. I guess that's not surprising, though, because it's politicians who are writing the tax laws. It's not neutral administrators or bureaucrats. It's people who have to run for re-election. And the tax code is an important way that they gain favors with their home districts.
Your point, I guess, is that it tries to do too much.
It tries to do too much. In some respects, it's successful in doing some of those things, but when you try to do too much, it becomes complicated. Some people would argue that at some point the tax code becomes so cluttered, as it did in the early 80s, that it leads to a stimulus for political reform. And we did see a major tax reform bill in 1986 during the second Reagan administration that cleaned out a lot of the tax provisions, special exemptions, special deductions that had been enacted in the 60s and 70s. And the benefit of the Tax Act of 1986 was we also had much lower tax rates. It was an unusual coalition of liberals who wanted to strip the tax code of these special exemptions, and conservatives who actually wanted to lower tax rates. It was a one-time, we've really only seen that kind of tax reform once in our generation, and the accumulation of legislation since 1986 has really gone the opposite direction. Especially we've seen in the last 2 or 3 tax acts, 93, 97, and 98, a major effort to use the code, the tax system as a political tool. And this time it's really Republicans in Congress that are using it and Democrats in the White House that are using it for helping their own constituents.
You are a Wynwood native who was a former political scientist and also a lawyer. You've spent a number of years researching and writing the book. In fact, you don't really mince words here in the preface of the book. You say, I was forced on a daily basis to confront the consequences of a tax policy out of control.
Well, I started practicing law just before 1986 and came out of law school right before this massive rewriting of the tax code, and it was actually a very interesting time. In my legal practice, we confronted lots of people who had been practicing tax law for 10, 20, 30 years who no longer knew what the tax law was. There were so many new provisions enacted and changes to the old system. In some respects, that's a very interesting time and a good opportunity. But it was also, as a political scientist, a former political scientist, I thought there was something curious about rewriting the tax code in such a massive way that the practitioners have difficulty. And that's something that all practitioners now struggle with. A lot of people think that accountants and tax lawyers like this complexity because they benefit. But I think most honest tax people, professionals, would admit that a lot of the provisions that are being enacted are just mindless complexity that achieve very little and don't even really enact social policies that we probably wouldn't even favor in the first place. And it's very frustrating, I think, for professionals to see that as the tax system.
Do you think consumers are confused or muffled by the whole tax system?
Well, the people, the ultimate consumer of the tax system is the taxpayer, and I dare say most people have difficulty filling out their own tax forms. Certainly, people with substance and economic wealth hire professionals to do it for them. Still, we talk about the complexity of the tax system. About 3/4 of the taxpayers actually file a 1040-EZ or a 1040 and claim the standard deduction. And that's actually not that complex. We're talking about a 1-page form or a 2-page form with a few schedules. Those people, though, don't have the level of expertise and sophistication, and even though it may not be that long or hard for a professional to do that kind of tax return, it is pretty difficult for the average taxpayer. The people who have really complex tax returns, corporations, it's not unusual to have 200-300-page tax return. Of course, they have a staff of accountants and tax people who put together their return. So they really don't feel the bite of the tax system, and in many respects, they're the ones that complain the least. Most of the complaints come from the people that really don't know how complex it really can be.
All right, we need to take a break. We'll talk a little bit more with Sheldon Pollack here on Fox Focus and more about what he calls the failure of U.S. tax policy when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Fox Focus. I'm Susan Buehler. We're talking to a Wynwood author who has written a book about the failure, what he calls the failure of U.S. tax policy. It is written by Sheldon Pollack. Thank you very much for joining us. Do you advocate the flat tax?
Well, actually, I've been very critical of the flat tax, but the truth is, if we could start afresh, if we had a new system, or I suppose if we were advising a new developing country, we might suggest something like the flat tax as a better system. The real essence of the flat tax is not that it's a single tax rate. The flat tax is really a consumption tax. And this is a popular proposal, and we'll hear more of it, I'm sure, in coming months as Steve Forbes is going to be running again for president on the flat tax as one of his main campaign themes. The flat tax, though, has a lot of problems. Its big appeal is that it's much simpler. But one of the reasons it's simpler is lots of the deductions and special provisions that we enjoy will be stripped out of that tax system, which in many respects they don't belong there anyway.
Like what specifically?
Well, the flat tax doesn't include things like a donation for charitable contributions. It's not really clear to us how that's going to affect universities, churches, museums, orchestras. To the extent that people contribute because they get a tax deduction, they may contribute less if they don't get a tax deduction. This flat tax does not include a deduction for the home mortgage interest, which is one of the largest tax expenditures in the budget. Some predictions are that the value of real estate could decline as much as 20 or 30% if we did away with the deduction for home mortgage. Lots of people take that into account when they buy a home. That would cause major dislocations in the economy. It's not clear how that would play out. Switching from one system to a very different kind of system is not as easy as it sounds. It's very politically appealing to tell people they're going to file on a postcard their tax return. Those of us that are struggling with our tax returns now would like that, but there's lots of drawbacks to that kind of system.
The book also outlines some myths that I want to go over for people that I think are kind of interesting points to talk about. And one of the myths, Americans are overtaxed. Second myth, rich people don't pay enough taxes. And corporations aren't paying their fair share of taxes and enjoy all sorts of corporate welfare. What do you mean Americans are overtaxed? Are we actually paying too much tax?
Well, I would never say we're not paying enough taxes, but it's a political claim that we're at the highest point of taxation now in our history in the post-war era. That's a lot of politicians are making hay of that figure. About 20.15 of our GDP is devoted to the income tax, but it's really very misleading. In fact, it really depends on who you are. The lower income scale is actually paying less taxes as a percentage of their gross income compared to 10 or 15 years ago. The middle class is paying really about the same as they paid 10 and 15 years ago. It's really the wealthy who are paying much more taxes than they did in 1986.
Which the second myth is rich people don't pay enough taxes.
Yeah, a lot of people think everybody else is getting away with something, everybody else has their loopholes, and you're the only one paying your fair share. Everyone else is avoiding the taxes. The wealthy actually contribute virtually all of the income that's raised under the income tax, depending, of course, how you define the wealthy. The top 1% of taxpayers are contributing 33% of the income that's raised from the income tax. The top 5% are contributing over 50% of the revenue that's raised by the income tax is coming from the 5% wealthiest. So clearly the wealthy are paying, and they're paying at a higher rate than they did 10, 15 years ago. On the other hand, there's always two sides of an argument. The wealthy are doing much better than they did 10 years ago. A higher percentage of the wealth that's been created in the last 10 years has gone to those people that had existing wealth. And so we really shouldn't feel sorry, even if the rich are paying more tax. They're doing better off than they were, which is probably why they're not complaining.
Right. Corporations aren't paying their fair of taxes, corporate welfare. Well,
there's always a lot of news stories about how corporations, profitable corporations, don't pay any taxes. A lot of that goes back to the early 80s when there were some big tax shelters that corporations were able to use. And we're seeing a little more of that, some creative tax shelters for corporations in the last few years. But the truth is, a lot of the loopholes were eliminated in 1986, and a lot of times when corporations have money, profit, financial profit, but don't pay taxes for the year, it may be because they had losses for the last 5 years. People don't understand that those losses can carry forward, and it's very misleading. A lot of political use is made from those kinds of statistics.
There's one other myth that I did want to mention because I think it's an interesting one, and it does affect a lot of people. Married people are penalized. What do you mean by that?
Well, the Republicans are running on a tax reform proposal now to cure what's called the marriage penalty. And in fact, there are some married people who, by virtue of getting married, pay more in income taxes than if they were both single. It's really, though, very particular. It's wealthy two-earner families that file a joint return can pay several $1,000s more tax by virtue of getting married. And that sounds bad. It sounds like we're penalizing people for being married. But the truth is that that's the political myth, but the truth is more people get a marriage bonus. The traditional family where there's only one earner and one person perhaps stays home and does housekeeping or domestic work, which isn't compensated, they actually enjoy a marriage benefit by virtue of getting married and filing on a joint return. So it's really very misleading to say that all married persons pay a penalty.
Sheldon Pollack, thank you very much for joining us. Interesting book. When we come back here on Fox Focus, we're going to be talking to two new guests who might have some tips for you if you're still working on your returns. Stay with us.